This is Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families and your window into the world of special education. Special needs parenting can be challenging, and we want to make it easier by providing you with the resources you need to help your child. Let's delve deep into the world of learning differently with your host, special education attorney Adam Dayan.
I am pleased to present Sarah Birnbaum as the next guest on the Curious Incident podcast. Sarah is a parent advocate and special education advisor. She is the owner of New York Special Needs Support, a consultancy practice that helps parents navigate the ins and outs of special education services and educational options for children in New York. Over the years, Sarah has gained a wealth of knowledge about therapists, agencies, schools, government bodies, and best practices. Sarah also helps parents to cope with the complicated emotions that accompany any special needs parenting decision. Sarah, it's great to have you on our show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It's great to have you here. So the presentations you give often focus on life after early intervention, also known as EI. What does that entail, and why is it such an important milestone?
Well, if you're like me, as a special needs parent, you go into early intervention thinking, oh, sure, people are telling me that I need to give my kids some therapy. I'll give them some therapy. They'll catch up and get better, and then I will go back to normal land. And if you still need services, and then the system is saying, no, you continue to need them now that you're heading into preschool, it starts to feel more real. So it is a little bit of a taste of the fact that this is not necessarily a temporary stay in your life, that this may be more of a real thing for you, and the temptation is to run away from it rather than to say, sure, I'll continue to give my child therapies. So it's not just logistically difficult, it's also emotionally challenging.
I think some parents, maybe a lot of parents, are coming in with certain expectations, thinking that this isn't a problem or it's a short-term problem, and that's not always the case, right?
It is, and it's never fun to have total strangers tell you that something is going on with your child. Even if you were the one to call early intervention in the first place, you're really hoping that they'll say, no, it's all in your head. Nothing is happening. You're just an over-worried parent. Good for you for calling an early intervention, points to you for being on the ball, but you don't have to worry. And for me, the beginning of my new life is when my child was in that first early intervention evaluation, and a bunch of people came out of a room with very serious looks on their faces and started telling me all the ways that she was behind. And I laughed and I said, it sounds like you're really worried. And one of them said with this totally grave face, we are. And that was the end of my old life and the beginning of my new life. And it is never fun to go through a transformation.
So it can definitely be a moment of awakening. Talk about what should parents' expectations be for dealing with the CPSC, which stands for the Committee on Preschool Special Education.
So early intervention is a home and community model that is focused on development. They want to know what your child is doing out at the grocery store, in your home, playing with you, learning things. CPSC switches to an educational model that is all about group learning. So it's a completely different mindset. Now they're going to be looking at ways that your child is communicating with their peers, playing with their peers. Are they learning at the same level? Are they able to use the skills that they're gaining in a group? So it's very important for parents to understand that, because we look at our kids in a vacuum and say, oh, 6 months ago you couldn't do these things and now you can. The question for CPSE is, can you do them in a group of your peers?
So a few important distinctions. Early intervention usually means 0 or birth to 3 years old, and you're dealing with the Department of Health. And then the child turns 3 and the family starts dealing with the Department of Education, and specifically the CPSE team. And as you said, it's an emphasis or a shift in emphasis from how is your development going to how are you among your peers.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so that can actually be helpful. I know plenty of parents whose kids did not qualify for therapies in early intervention who were able to obtain them in CPSE, because you can show that even though your child does have a lot of words and may have better receptive language than expressive language, now you're going to struggle to communicate in a classroom, get your needs known, explain what you want. make friends. And now you can say that language delay is really significant because it's going to keep my child from making appropriate preschool progress.
Right. So a big emphasis on how is this child going to function in the classroom.
That's right.
What is the Turning 5 process? And talk about the transition from CPSE to CSE, which is the Committee on Special Education.
So New York City does something really cool where they say, we don't want your child to have to start from scratch in kindergarten. If your child already has an individualized educational program, or IEP, in CPSE and preschool, if they continue to need services, we want to make sure that they have them on day one, which means that we're going to introduce you to the Committee on Special Education, which takes over at age 5, in the spring before your child enters kindergarten. It's people always say, well, my child is born in January, or my child is born in November. When is their Turning 5 meeting going to be? It doesn't matter when their birthday is. It's all going to happen in that spring. And what that means is that you're going to be reassessed, rejudged, to decide whether you still qualify for services. And if your child does, then they'll have an IEP waiting for them in the fall. That's the great part. The difficult part is that it's a completely different system, a completely different mindset. Parents have often been able to sort of make bargains with their CPSE administrator, come up with more flexible and idiosyncratic programming, get extra stuff, be able to say, this doesn't work, but that does. Once you are in CSE, they have a more rigid set of offerings, and they're going to want to put your child in one of them, and that's that. There are no more bargains to be made.
Parents who come to our office are always shocked by this. If they've been dealing with the CPSE and now they're transitioning to Turning 5 and starting to deal with CSE, they notice a big difference in those interactions, and they always want to know why. What's changed? Why has it become so much more rigid?
I don't know the policy decisions behind why the city allows for these kinds of things. Like, there's no such thing as a special education itinerant teacher in kindergarten anymore. There's no more, well, my child just needs a little bit of help, somewhere between 2 and 15 hours of special ed support in a mainstream classroom. Now they want you in a general education classroom, or an integrated co-teaching classroom, or a self-contained classroom, and that's it. So it is always shocking for families because they've maybe forged a relationship with their CPSE administrator who is dealing with them as an individual and is able to come up with more individualized solutions. CSE is very, very different. There's a continuum of services, and they're going to find a place for your child in there.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit more about why this Turning 5 meeting with the CSE is so consequential?
Well, if the early intervention to CPSE was the dawning that this might actually be your real life, once it's kindergarten, then it is impossible to ignore. Now it is really real. Certainly, I thought that we would be back in normal life. My expected parenting plan and life plan would be done by kindergarten, and then we would rejoin the rest of the world. But now you are leaving. You are sort of parting from the peer group that you've had since you had babies, and no one else understands what you're talking about. Your life is full of acronyms. You're looking at school programs that you might never have expected, and you don't want to be there, but you have to be there because people in your life are telling you, well, this is what your child needs, and part of you wants to fight it. Part of you understands it's what your child needs. People are saying things to you that make you feel bad. It is never fun when you're with a group of parents at the playground and you start talking about kindergarten and they have no idea where you're talking about sending your child to school or even looking. It's very isolating and lonely. And it can be really difficult and drive parents to want to turn their back on what their child needs just out of the sheer desire to continue with what you always hoped and expected would be your life.
So is that why, in your opinion, parents find this to be something that is huge and terrifying, this feeling of isolation and loneliness, this departure from their old group of friends, this departure from what they had expected to their new realization of what life is for their child? I
think it's a big part of it. And also, you don't want to be there. No one wants to be there. This is not what any of us signed up for. Or most of the time it is not what you planned on. So you find yourself fighting for something that you don't want anyway. And that's a really difficult feeling. And there's time and energy and resources that you have to spend on doing this thing that you really would have preferred not to have to do in the first place. And people are making you feel bad for it. They're making you feel like you're greedy or that you're somehow think you're better than other people because you're looking for a more specific solution for your child. They're all going to public school. Why can't you just go to public school like them? Didn't you move into this neighborhood because it has a great public school? So it really is sort of a self-deportation act where you're saying, I am walking away from everything I ever understood. And it's hard to explain to your parents. It's hard to explain to your in-laws. It's hard to explain to friends who don't get it, which is why I always encourage parents, find other special needs families. They're the only ones who really get it. They will not need the acronyms translated. They will not need you to explain why you're doing certain things. And they're going to be the best group of people to spend your time with. It's very tiring to try to explain your existence over and over and over again.
I imagine it is. I'm sure it is. What are the most important things for parents to know about?
So the critical thing for me is always to understand that there is what your child needs, and then there's what is available in the system. And if those two things align, congratulations. You have won the lottery, and you will have a much easier time dealing with the kindergarten transition process. Then there is often a gap between what your child needs and what's available in the system. And the system is not going to look at your child and say, oh, let's figure out what Billy needs. They're going to say, here's what we have for Billy. Let's figure out whether this works or that works or the other works. And what if none of it works? Then you have an issue. But they will make it seem to you that they have exactly what your child needs. And they may, but you need to know for sure what you think your child needs so that that's what you're fighting for.
Yes, and I know during the talks that you often give, you emphasize having a backup plan, right? It's important for parents to have a backup plan in case the system can't support what that child needs. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And the question is whether you're going to do it for kindergarten or whether you're going to try what the system is offering you in kindergarten and then take it from there. So plenty of the families I work with, for various reasons, totally legitimate reasons, want to try kindergarten in public school. They're not ready to let go of the idea, or there's a question of time and energy and resources. They may not totally know what their child needs. They may say, no, I really think that I want to try it. Kindergarten is a great time to try that because the stakes are lower. The class size is usually a little bit smaller than first grade and onward. I'm all for that. And what I usually say is, if you do that, it's a good idea to set up an independent evaluation for your child to occur midway through the fall of that kindergarten year. If you haven't already had your child independently assessed and gotten a sense of what they need, then what you're really saying is, I'm going to try the road test. I'm going to enroll my child in kindergarten and see how it goes. And if it goes well, fabulous. What I really hope when I give those Turning 5 talks is that every single person attending them is able to send their child to public school and have it be a wonderful experience for them. That is what every child deserves under the law, and as taxpayers, what we're owed. If that is not what ends up happening, you're going to be very glad that you had an independent evaluation of your child already on the books so that you're not scrambling in the fall. And if your child is truly thriving in kindergarten and you don't need that evaluation, the neuropsychologist is not going to get mad at you. If you say, great news, my child is having a bang-up year, they'll just say, no problem. And then they'll go to the next person on their wait list because they always have a wait list. So you will not offend or anger them. They'll be thrilled to hear that your child is doing well. And then on you go. And that's what I would say is any time you want to try out a less restrictive public setting, as long as you have an evaluation waiting for you, you really cannot go wrong because then you have time to make a plan B for the following year.
Right. It's a safe way to play it. You're assuming the best about the public school system, keeping an open mind to see whether it's going to be appropriate for your child. And in the event that it turns out it isn't, you have a plan in place to have the evaluation to clue you in as to what's going on with your child. And you're doing your own research so that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket and you're making sure that you're in a position to do what's needed for your child.
That's right, because no one is going to advocate for your child the way you do. And this way, you get to really see what the system has for your child day to day, rather than just saying to yourself, well, how bad can it be? I'm sure it'll be fine. This is a great school. It's around the corner. It's why I moved to this neighborhood. All that may be absolutely true, but I would like you to have that little kernel in the back of your head that says, what if? Here's my plan.
Exactly. So what are some of the pitfalls?
I would say one of the biggest pitfalls is to look at your child in more of a vacuum and say, he started out nonverbal, then he had only 5 words, now he has hundreds of words. That trajectory is inevitably going to keep going. Another pitfall is to say, well, preschool is going really well, so I'm sure elementary school will go well too. Continuing to think that what has been happening is going to keep happening based on a gut feeling or what you're seeing at home. I would say we are always told as parents, don't compare your child to other kids. But in this case, it's actually not great advice. You should be looking at your child as compared against their same age peers. So one of the pitfalls is to look at your child against only themselves and their specific progress. So it's important to be with your child in a group as much as possible so that you understand what they're doing, what they're capable of. I remember myself, one of the reasons I called early intervention was being at one of my baby play groups and having another parent talk about how her child, if you said, go in your room and get your sweater, would do it. And I thought, what kind of baby geniuses are these? That's ridiculous. My kid isn't doing anything like that. And then I really thought about that. Like, maybe it's not that other kid. Maybe it's mine. But if I hadn't seen those other babies in action, it wouldn't have occurred to me.
Right. So seeing them in that type of setting where they're with other children their age, paying attention to how they're showing up among their peers is really important. And I know you've talked about making decisions based on parents' wishes rather than what their kids truly need. And I find that point so important to emphasize here and to examine a little bit further, because we all experience this, right? We want a certain outcome, and then things are going differently, and we're fighting it or struggling to see the reality of the situation, and then tension builds up because what we want is contradicting the reality of the situation, and that needs to get resolved, doesn't it?
It is really, 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 really hard. It takes a lot of energy to strenuously not notice something, and that is what happens to us a lot as parents because we just don't want to believe that our children are not developing typically. So that's why you pick up the phone and ask for that first evaluation, is because your sense, I call it the Miss Clavel sense from the Madeline books, where you sit up in the middle of the night and say something is not right. When your Miss Clavel sense overrules your desire for normality and the expected life, then eventually, what is it, the irresistible force and the immovable object? One of those things is going to get out of the way. In the meantime, it is really hard and really difficult and fraught to fight yourself. And it is tempting to believe the system when the system says, don't worry, we have exactly what your child needs. This is a great school. We'll take care of your child. The desire to say, oh, I'm sure you're right. I trust you. You have what I always wanted. It is contradictory to fight for something you don't want. It is, it doesn't make sense as humans to have to advocate for something that you really don't want anyway. So where things usually fall apart, there's usually a moment where you are confronted. People usually can remember the time when they realized something was going on with their child, whether it was a preschool tour or an elementary school tour where they looked around and said, these kids are doing things that mine will not be able to do for a long time. And that's why, to me, the more schools you can visit, the better. Because if you look around that room and really try to picture your child there, and you can't do it, then it's impossible to continue to tell yourself that things are just going to get better.
I want to get back to this point about fighting for something you don't want, and I meant to comment on it before. I don't know if you would describe it as a moment of maturity or growth or clarity, but the realization that it isn't something that you want, but it's the thing that needs to be done for the growth and well-being of your child. How do you grapple with that as a parent? How do you get to the point of saying, this isn't what I want, it's not what I would have designed, but it's what has to happen, and I'm going to fight for this thing, even though it's not what I want, because I know it's best for my child?
Many tearful nights, wine, chocolate, other friends who get it, who are in the same boat with you. It's like being born all over again. It's like you are transforming into this other person that you didn't want to be, but you have to, because it's what your child is asking you to do for them.
Right. So whatever those senses are, you mentioned Madeline. I'm thinking of Spider-Man because my kids love Spider-Man. If your spidey senses are tingling, whatever those senses are that are giving you the signal that something is not right, as a parent, you got to listen to those signals and investigate it or examine it further.
That's right. And your pediatrician may be saying, oh, everything is fine. And other people in your life, maybe there's this tremendous desire to normalize things. Human beings have an optimism bias, and when people balk at that, sometimes the group will not shun you, but will say, oh, you're making too much of this. There's this sort of temptation to say, if I don't do anything, everything will be fine. So yes, you have to make a decision. It usually is the first time you say, I need an evaluation. It is the beginning of your new life, because what it means is that you're listening to your gut, and the gut inside your gut, and not anybody else.
Sarah, what questions do you get most often from parents?
Why doesn't the Department of Education have anything for my child in the public system? I don't understand. My kid is really complicated, but the system doesn't seem to have anything for complicated children. Why didn't anybody tell me it was going to be like this? Why is it so hard? Those are the questions I usually get. They're more existential.
And just focusing on the second of the questions you mentioned, it's one of the reasons that I appreciate your seminars so much. That's that you're getting information out there so that parents do know and can say, Sarah Birnbaum told me so. And you're equipping them and arming them with information and resources that they might not otherwise have had. And that's so important.
Well, thank you. I do like being able to help people feel more knowledgeable. I always say that it's not just that knowledge is power, but the antidote to anxiety is action. If you can take action, you will feel less helpless. You will feel less trapped. You will feel less in an existential stew of just constant worry about your child, because there's things that you can do. Mm-hmm. And doing them helps you feel better about all of it.
I know that you're a parent of a child with special needs. You alluded to this earlier, and you've been navigating this world, this special education world, for many years. What key points do you know now that you wish you had known sooner in the process?
I was actually extremely lucky. I entered the special needs world in the early 2000s, and it was before the economic downturn. There were great early intervention agencies. I worked with one that doesn't exist anymore. I got lots of help from the Early Childhood Direction Center, which the New York State, shut down a few years ago. I had lots of great support, and that's actually one of the reasons I started doing this, is that I noticed that a lot of parents weren't able to find that information. Even 5 or 6 years later, some of the supports and information that I had availed myself of were gone.
You were lucky.
I was extraordinarily lucky. It's just timing. On the other hand, parents these days can find one another much more easily because of the internet. It was just there were a couple of mom boards that I was on that were text-based and very helpful, but there was nothing like these special needs groups. Now you can find a Facebook group for your child's microdeletion and find other parents that you might never have been able to find in those days. So that is a good thing. And fellow parents are the best resources. So I would say that the key point is to find your people. You will get information from them that you can't get anywhere else. In fact, the reason I called early intervention is I happened to be at the playground one day swinging my child, and the person next to me was saying, oh, I'm a little worried because my daughter isn't walking yet. And I said, I'm a little worried because mine isn't talking yet. And the mom, who I didn't know, said, Well, I know somebody who works at an early intervention agency. Here's their name and number.
Wow.
Yep.
Coincidence, just randomly in the park talking to another parent.
That's right. We had coffee 15 years later, and neither of us has ever forgotten that day.
Wow. That's powerful. We'll come back to the importance of community in a minute. How can parents ensure that their child will receive an appropriate education?
The first and most important step in that is to know what constitutes an appropriate education for them. You have to know what your child needs. That means you need to find it out, and then you have to figure out whether that's available in the public school system or if you need to go outside the system, whatever that means, whether it means fighting for something outside the public system or just leaving New York City entirely and moving to a suburban district that might be able to do it better. It all starts with an independent neuropsychological evaluation. For me, that is the most essential part of this because it will be the most comprehensive look at your child's cognitive and academic and social, emotional, and executive functioning skills. But most importantly, what that report will tell you is, here's the kind of school setting that your child needs in order to make the progress they're capable of making. And nothing else is going to do that. So once you find that out, you can decide what your next step is. Do I leave? Do I stay? Do I try public? Do I fight for private? Do I do something entirely different? Do I leave the country? Until you know what your child needs, everything else is guesswork.
The very first episode that we did on this podcast was about understanding the importance of the neuropsychological evaluation. So I just want to echo what you said. It's super important in our practice as legal practitioners. We put a big emphasis on the neuropsychological evaluation. And for any listeners who want to understand that process better, you can listen to episode 1. Let's talk a little bit about timing. Timing in terms of the neuropsych, timing in terms of your seminars, timing in terms of planning. How soon do parents need to get started, and what's the first step they should take?
So I give early bird turning 5 talks in the spring, and then I give the same set of talks the following fall. In that set of early bird turning 5 talks, I usually say to people, go ahead and call neuropsychologists now. It seems silly because your child is not even 4 yet, may have just, turned 3 a little while ago. But it's a good idea to get something in the works so that by the time you go through the turning 5 process on the city's calendar, in the spring before the fall they enter kindergarten, you know what they need. You've been able to figure it out. You've been able to make a plan, make decisions, and decide what you're going to do, because the turning 5 meeting is not the start of the process, it's the end of the process.
And just to clarify, we talked about the turning 5 meeting happening the spring before kindergarten. Your early bird seminar is a full year before that turning 5 CSE meeting.
That is correct. I do recommend doing that. You don't have to do anything other than investigate neuropsychologists, but if you wait until the fall to start calling, you might find people say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm booked until January. So it's a good idea to call around. You don't necessarily have to bring your child in. In fact, there's reasons to wait until the summer into the fall. And a lot of experts think that you should do the evaluation in the fall and then maybe do one last evaluation session in the early winter to make sure that the information is as fresh as possible for your actual turning 5 meeting. But let's just say your child was born in 2020. In the spring of 2024, I will give webinars for kids born in 2020 who are going to be turning 4 this year so that they can learn what their child needs by the early fall of 2024, look around at what's available in and out of the system over the course of the fall into the winter of 2025, and by the time they sit down with their CSE team in the spring of 2025, they know what they're doing. And what I always say is, you may decide to do exactly what your turning 5 team is recommending, but I want you to do it with full knowledge.
Right. I love the way you lay that out, and it underscores the importance of the planning. This stuff takes time, and you got to get the appointment, and you got to do the testing sessions, and you got to have the feedback, and you got to get the report, and you need to do some research once you have the report. And you want to get started early. It's super important to get started early so that you can be prepared for that turning 5 CSE meeting.
Right. And so you're not scrambling. You're not in a panic. You don't feel like you missed out. So I do recommend, it seems silly because here you are, it's not even the end of your child's first year in CPSE, and I'm already talking about turning 5. I don't want to give people additional anxiety. So there's nothing else to do except to investigate those things. People say, well, should I go look at schools? No, do that in the fall. What you need to do right now is make sure that someone is going to be giving you that objective view into your child's ability to learn in a large classroom. That's it. That's really what you need to find out from this report. Can my child learn appropriately in a large DOE classroom, or do they need something smaller and more specific? And if so, what do I do?
And as you said, action is the antidote to anxiety.
I do think that.
So we talked about the neuropsychological evaluation. Are there any other kinds of evaluations or reports that you consider to be essential?
Nothing that I consider essential. There are other things that I think are nice to have, an additional speech evaluation, an additional OTs, something from your child's SEEIT. You don't have to rely only on the progress reports that they are legally required to send to your Turning 5 team. If you think that they can be helpful to you, have them write a specific letter of support to your Turning 5 team. Dear IEP team, I work with Jennifer, and here's what I think she needs. Here's what I see in the classroom. Here's the way I see her using her language and her play skills. Ask them for that. But nothing else is quite as essential as the neuropsych eval. That is the core.
So I think we've already discussed the more parents understand their children's needs, the better they can advocate. Is there anything else you think they can be doing or should be doing to understand their children's needs?
I'm a big believer in taking your child to as many birthday parties as you possibly can, because those are very big eye openers. I often recommend it if I work with a parent where they say, my spouse or partner doesn't really get it. They think our child is doing better than I know that they are. So I say, have your spouse or partner bring that child to the next 5 birthday parties without you. You should not be there to mitigate things and get your child out of a difficult situation. Your spouse or partner needs to see what your child is like when all the other kids are in an activity and the structure is working for them and your child is the outlier. Because that's really what it's about, is your child an outlier in the group? And does everyone who works with this child understand that? Because for me, the name of the game is the right kindergarten setting is one where your child is not the outlier. So if you have a lot of friends with neurotypical children, attending a birthday party or even just a big play date with them can be really helpful, both for you and somebody else who isn't quite there yet.
That's a great point. And we see this pretty often in our practice, that parents come to our office with different perspectives on their child. And if you're going to be pursuing this process and advocating for support and services, you want to be on the same page about what's needed. So I think that's a great suggestion.
It's hard, though. Birthday parties are like you as the parent will probably end up being more upset than your child is if they have a hard time.
Right. What resources do you recommend to parents who are new to this process?
I do recommend not just coming to my own webinars, but going to any, held by anybody, neuropsychologists, special education attorneys, the DOE itself. Get as much information as you possibly can because it's all helpful. There's no such thing as unhelpful information. And most importantly, find those fellow parents, because that's where you won't just get information, you'll get information from people who know what it feels like.
That's a great segue. Let's come back to that. How important is it for parents to be part of a supportive special needs community with parents who are going through similar challenges?
It's incredibly important. I'm still friends with the one parent who went through the CPSE and Turning 5 process with me, and I still think about those early days. If I didn't have one person in my life who got it, I might have gone absolutely around the bend, because people around you are just saying incredibly hurtful things without realizing it. And you have to develop a thicker skin, but there are times when you want to take that armor off and just be yourself. And that's really hard to do unless the person you're with gets it. And they might not have the same diagnosis. Their child might be at a different level developmentally, but they're still going through something that you're going through. So if you don't have that, then finding it is, to me, just about the most important thing you can do, aside from getting an evaluation, is finding someone that you can be yourself with.
So we talked about the social media groups. Do you have any other suggestions about how parents can form or find that community?
Try your child's preschool, the sensory gym where your child gets services. Ask your therapist, is there another family that you work with that might be available for a facilitated play date? But these days, really, most people are on the internet, which is good and bad because you don't want to just stay on the internet. I would say if you meet someone on a Facebook group, make a coffee date. Find them. Go to the playground when the weather gets warm. You will be so glad that you've formed even a small community, and you don't need a huge posse. You just need one person.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Sarah, we've had parents come to our firm decide to hold off on engaging our services for the time being and then return to our office 2 to 3 years later, really concerned about their children's regression. What advice do you have for parents who are thinking that they'll wait and see?
As I said earlier, I have absolutely no problem with waiting and seeing as long as you do have that backstop of an evaluation. Where parents get into trouble is when they say, I'm done. I'm just going to enroll my child in this school and it'll be fine. How bad can it be? And it's hard to pay for something to get you information that you really don't want to hear, but it is important. And as I said, you can always set something up and then cancel it later. So a lot of kids have sort of turning points. Kindergarten is a big one. Also, third grade is kind of where it hits the fan a lot of the time. The line that people use is that's where kids stop learning to read and start reading to learn. And every year, the requirements and expectations for independence go up. So when you're waiting and seeing, it's really important to see that group as much as possible. Volunteer to go on a field trip. Read to your child's classroom. Stand around at pickup and drop off. Look at the other kids and really say to yourself, is my child in the mix? Is my child right in the middle of that group? Or are they increasingly out on the edges? Are they really becoming an outlier? And if they are, follow your gut, even though you don't want to, and set up an evaluation.
You want to talk a little bit about the benefits of pushing through against that resistance of the thing you don't want to do, or paying for that thing that you don't really want anyhow. If you do that and you get to the other side, how would you describe or explain some of the benefits?
It is enormously empowering when you say to yourself, I don't care what anybody else thinks. I don't care what my mother or my mother-in-law thinks. I don't care what my friends with neurotypical kids think. I know something is going on and I'm going to find out more about it. And you just get this sense of relief because you're not trying to juggle while riding a unicycle on a tightrope anymore. It takes so much energy to try to maintain that everything is okay feeling. Once you say to yourself, maybe something's going on, I'm going to investigate it, it's like a balloon pops inside you. And it is incredibly freeing.
I just took a deep sigh. I don't know why I took a deep sigh.
Because when you think about special needs parenthood, you think about you're going around with your shoulders hunched all the time. When is this going to get better? I remember turning around and looking at my child in the car seat saying, oh, did you see that? Did you see what she just did? That was good, right? At a certain point, you have to let it go. And when you let it go, that's when you can start moving forward. And the only way out is through.
Yeah. The only way out is through. How can parents learn what's available both within and without the public school system?
I would say that the best thing you can do is there are lists, there's webinars, the Parents League does stuff, I do things. There are I keep coming back to those parent online groups. There are books published by special education attorneys. Once you decide this is what you want to do, there will be ways to find out about the alternative programs, neuropsychologists, special education attorneys, other parents. There's not that many of these alternative schools out there. It seems like a huge list, but it really isn't. So the most important thing is to understand that there's some of them that will be appropriate for your child. There are some that might be appropriate for your child, either not restrictive enough or too restrictive. And then there's a bunch that are just beside the point. So zeroing in on the handful of schools where your child might be a fit saves you a lot of time and energy. And I do think it's a better idea to over-tour and over-investigate and potentially over-apply to these programs so that you are looking as broadly as possible. Once you start looking at these schools and you get inside them, now that, thank goodness, the pandemic is over and they're having in-person tours again, you should be able to tell just by walking around the school if you can envision your child there. When they give the presentation, are they talking about kids like yours? And if they are, you should apply.
Options. You want to have options. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket.
That's right.
How can parents connect with best practice experts?
I know I sound like a broken record. Fellow parents. Get referrals from people you trust. Also, talk to your therapist. Talk to your SEED. Talk to your preschool. Talk to anyone who knows anyone. The most important thing is to get a referral from someone you trust.
Absolutely. We may have touched on this already, but any other advice for parents applying to and touring school programs?
Go to more than you think you need to. Give yourself space to feel bad the first couple of times because you don't want to be there. Probably this was not part of the life you envisioned. And there's reasons why people, there's almost always someone who might get upset at one of these tours, and they get it. The people who run these schools really understand how hard it is for parents. They are not out there to exclude your child. They're not looking for perfect children. They just want to help your child. That is a very big difference from the mainstream private school world, where they really are looking to be very picky. All the private special ed schools want to know is, would your child be right for this school? And would your child be right for the classroom that we're putting together next fall? Everything else is irrelevant. So the more of these schools you can get into, the more you will understand how they differ from public programs, from mainstream private programs, and from one another.
And at the same time that it's about the school determining if they think the student is a good fit, it's also about the parents determining if they think their child is well suited for the school. So ask lots of questions, because it's not just about getting accepted to the school, but you also want to make sure that you believe your child would fit in well in that program.
That's right. You should have a list of questions from the experts in your life. You should look around at the kids you're seeing. You should be able to say to yourself, I see kids who remind me of my son there. I can see him doing this, versus walking into a classroom and saying, I don't think that my daughter could make it here. I don't think she would do well here. And the other thing is that there's a lot of emotions wrapped up in this. And if you apply for your child to a program and they don't get in, it does feel like a judgment. But what the school is really doing is judging itself and saying, we don't think that we can give your child the education that he deserves. So we would be failing him if he came here. It's not that he's not good enough for us. It's that we're not good enough for him.
And those emotions are real at various stages of this process. I'm going to come back to the emotional component in a few moments. Any tips for how parents can manage a staff of therapists who are providing services to a child?
Well, I always say use your workplace skills. Come up with a shared calendar. Make sure to loop everyone in. Whatever management skills you use in the workplace, use them with your therapists. Ask for things with a smile. Say thank you a lot. Praise them, and then make an ask. And remember also that they have lots of families that they're working with. When you want something, make sure that it's important enough, because if you ask them for stuff all the time, then they will start to ignore you or take you less seriously. So you have to judge what is hair on fire critical with what is slightly annoying, the same way that you would if you were talking to one of your coworkers or employees.
Right. I think this is important, especially for parents who have children with complex needs. There can be many therapists or providers involved, and I think it's important to stay organized and have good communication with everybody who's serving that child.
Yes, and also to understand that sometimes they're going to disagree with one another, and then it feels like you have to referee. So one of the best things you can do is if you can schedule team meetings. In the old days, they used to be in person. Perhaps you could do it now on Zoom to sort of air everything out and prioritize so that you don't feel like you are constantly trying to be an air traffic controller.
That's a great point. Sarah, you've commented in the past that parents have more power, control, and agency than they think. Can you explain what you mean by that comment?
The story you tell in a meeting with people from the Department of Education can often change the game. So the way you explain things is really powerful. That comes from knowing your child, unabashedly representing their interests, understanding what they need, and saying to yourself, I'm a taxpayer. My child deserves this. I am not asking for anything more than anyone else would want for their child. I am not being greedy. I don't think I'm special. Anybody else in my place would do this. And the best way that you have agency is by having an incredibly clear sense of what your child needs, and everything else falls away.
Yeah, and I guess I would say 2 points in response. That perception or idea of I'm being greedy is prevalent. I've spoken with a lot of parents who don't want to be greedy or take anything that they aren't entitled to. And I think it's important for parents to know that their children deserve this and they are entitled to this. So they're not being greedy by asking for or pursuing what their children are entitled to. And the other point is that sometimes it doesn't have to be you who's telling the story to the team. You can marshal experts in support of what your child needs, whether that's a neuropsychologist who's participating in the meeting with the IEP team or some provider who's familiar with your child. You have that opportunity to bring people who know your child and have them tell part of the story to the team.
Yes. And what it really comes down to is if you know what your child needs, everything else falls away. And you say, I have a report that says exactly what he needs. The federal special education law says he's entitled to it. And by doing it this way, by fighting for his needs when he's very young and his brain is more elastic, I'm actually saving the government untold funds down the line when it would be much more expensive. So I always say that we are doing the system a favor by calling them to account when our children are young, when help makes the most difference. If you need any kind of intestinal fortitude, say to yourself, the system should be thanking me for doing this because I am doing something so that it will not have to spend money on my child later.
Well said. Any other suggestions about how parents can take control of the process?
There's a Joe Jackson song, you can't get what you want till you know what you want. So where we get into trouble is when we're not sure what we want, because that's when people see an opportunity to kind of sway us. And it does mean, if that means public school, that means public school. If that means leaving the city and saying, I don't want to deal with this, that's what it means. If it means fighting for something outside the public system, then you do it. The more you are sure of yourself, the more you communicate that sense to everyone around you. You are not going to mess with me. I know what my child needs, and I am here to represent them.
Reminds me of that Alice in Wonderland scene where Alice questions which road should I take, and one of the characters says, where do you want to go? And she says, it doesn't matter. If you don't know where you're trying to go, you're not going to have a path for getting there. So understand your child and know the outcome that you're trying to achieve so that everything else will fall into place.
Right. And I always say, own your crazy. Say, this process is making me crazy. And I understand that. But my child deserves something specific, and I'm not going to let anyone get away with denying it to him. It's what he is owed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So let's come back to the emotional piece. What advice do you have for parents regarding how they can cope with the complicated emotions that accompany special needs parenting decisions?
Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, whatever that means. If that means taking bubble baths, if that means watching bad television, if that means having dinner with friends and saying, I don't want to talk about anything. I just want to talk about reality TV. Or conversely, if it means avoiding everyone in your life who doesn't truly understand you, then that is worth it. Whatever it means for you, do that for yourself, because this is a really hard process. Give yourself space to feel all your feelings so that you can feel them and move through them and then get back to the task at hand. Because when you refuse to feel your emotions, they don't go away. They just dog you. They stay around and they drag you down. If you say, this is a really hard process, I'm going to be nice to myself, and then pick yourself up and make sure to limit the amount of time you spend with people who are questioning you or asking you why you're doing a certain thing or denying that everything is really happening. This just goes back to please spend as much time as possible with fellow special needs parents. If you have people in your life who are not special needs parents who give you space to talk about what's going on, it's great, but it's really hard for them to understand your reality, and it's really exhausting to explain your reality to people who don't know it. And you don't have to. You don't have to march in a parade. You do not have to put a magnet on the back of your car. It is not your job to explain the special needs and special education system to people who don't get it. You are not required to explain to people in the playground, well, FAPE stands for free and appropriate public education, and it's given in the least restrictive environment, and that's why I'm looking at these other schools. It is not your job. I usually say, if you can come up with one sentence to say without bursting into tears, in a somewhat sure tone of voice, like, well, it turns out that Tommy has some special education needs, so we're looking at smaller schools. If you say that in a sort of brisk way, people will take their cue from you. They will not ask you questions. It's when you sound unsure of yourself and say, it's a little school on the Upper East Side. You've probably never heard of it. Then they get curious and ask you questions that are hurtful. And they don't mean to be hurtful. They're just curious. If you sound like you know what you're doing, they'll say, oh, okay. And they'll just move on.
Great nuggets in there about self-care and surrounding yourself with people who are supportive and know what you're talking about. And I think also knowing that you have the tools to do what you need to do for your child is very helpful to keep in mind. You know your child best. You are going to fight zealously. And if you need any support, you have the agency and control to assemble a team of experts who will help you through the process. So you're not alone. You've got other parents out there, you've got professionals out there, and you've got your own skill set, which is more than enough to make sure your child gets what they need.
Exactly. Every person listening to this, if you're a special needs parent, I have total faith that you will be able to handle this process. You've come this far. You took care of evaluating your child when there were voices in your head and outside screaming at you not to do it, and you ignored them and you did it anyway. There are thousands of parents out there doing exactly what you're doing. You are not alone. And this is a hard task that you probably didn't ask for. So I want you to remember me, because your child can't thank you for doing all this work and spending all this time and money on their behalf. So please remember me thanking you for doing it, because it can feel somewhat thankless. A lot of the work that we put in with our children doesn't have an immediate evidence that it's working. So we have to go on faith. So I'm here to buck you up and say, you're doing all the right things. You're doing a great job. Pat yourself on the back, and then definitely have some chocolate.
Give yourself some grace and have some chocolate. Excellent. Sarah, before we wrap up, where can listeners learn more about you and your seminars?
So I have a website at nyspecialneeds.com, and I put up there whenever I am giving a webinar. People can sign up for them. They're always free. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes it's me and other experts. And I usually do them more than once a cycle. There's other information on my website about how to get in touch with me and what I do. So I encourage people to look at my website. Other than that, I'm not really on social media very much. I'm very old-fashioned. I came of age in the early 2000s, so I just have a website, but that's where to find me. And I encourage anybody who's curious, come to one of the free webinars, and then feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'd be happy to talk to you.
Excellent. Did we cover everything? Is there anything you think we missed or that you want to add or clarify before I bring us home?
The one thing I would say that I didn't necessarily say, which you can maybe edit in somewhere else, is that there's a big temptation to hide from this process.
Any final words before we conclude?
Run at the problem. Fear is normal. Anxiety is normal. It will not leave you until you start to take control of the process. By facing those fears, you will help quell them. Take action and your anxiety will lessen.
Sarah, I want to thank you so much for being here and for continuing to raise awareness about the special education process. Your talks are legendary and so informative. I remember attending one many years ago when I was first starting out in this field. Parents are lucky to have you as a resource, and I know your words will be helpful to our listeners as they embark on their journey of navigating the special education process.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming to my talk all those years ago when they were in person. Now, post-pandemic, they're all online, which is great because we can give more of them. We don't have to worry about fire codes or finding a space. And I'm thrilled to be able to get the word out in a way that people can listen to when they're taking a walk or anywhere else and don't have to come to a webinar at a specific time. So I really appreciate your giving me the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families. Don't forget to subscribe for a new episode every month. For more resources and helpful information, check out our website and blog at dayanlawfirm.com. This podcast provides general information which is not intended to and does not constitute legal advice. You should not rely on this information for any purpose. For legal counsel, you should consult with an attorney to discuss your specific circumstances. Your listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC. No attorney-client relationship is established unless a retainer agreement has been executed between the client and the law offices of Adam Dayan. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any guests featured or resources mentioned on this podcast are for information purposes and are not endorsed by the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC.